Story 1. The Under. Okay, I don't usually do this, but I guess I probably should just in case they ask for further evidence or something. My name is Graham Luciani. I'm 28 years old, living alone in my childhood home. I inherited it several years ago after both my mom and dad passed away, separately of course. My mother died first, and a couple of years later, my father died and left the place to me. It can sometimes be quite difficult living there. I'm the youngest of 8 children, so you can imagine how big the house would have had to have been to accommodate that many people. The loneliness is sometimes maddening. And it doesn't help that my employment consists of me sat alone in a room and putting numbers into a computer. No human interaction there either. When I inherited the house, it wasn't in a particularly livable condition. I don't know how my parents had managed it. Windows were boarded up, the garden was overgrown, and the house's interior was just dusty and dirty from neglect. After about a week or so, I managed to get the place looking pretty decent, but after a while, the massive size of the house just proved to be way too much for me to handle and caretake. I decided that rather than selling up and moving out, I should convert the house into 2 smaller attached houses and rent one of them out. I wouldn't have to clean as much, and I would be able to collect rent money from whoever moved in. The renovations would pay for themselves in no time that way. It sounded ideal. In the town where I live, before making any major modifications to your lot, however, having a pool fitted, demolition, building expansion, etc., you have to first visit the city hall, discuss your plans, and ask for permission. Most of the time, it's pretty straightforward and simple. Apparently, my case wasn't, though. I visited City Hall after making an appointment with a Mr. Alan Carter, who was the acting lot development supervisor at the time. I took a seat in his office, and after I discussed my idea to develop my house into 2 attached houses, he used his intercom to ask for someone to collect the blueprints to my house from the records room so I could clearly explain exactly what I was talking about and what I planned to do. After a couple of minutes of small talk, a rather attractive young lady entered the room carrying a rolled-up piece of A3 paper. She handed it to Mr. Carter, and after a smile at me, she left and didn't return. Everything was going fine until Mr. Carter showed me the blueprints. I didn't even see it at first, but after a little while, I noticed that there seemed to be a door leading to a small room with a set of stairs in what was at the time my kitchen. I pointed it out to Carter, and he gave me an odd look. "Mr. Luciani, this appears to be a basement staircase." I was astounded. I had lived in this house for almost 20 years altogether, born, left home and returned again, and I had never once known about any basement. I asked Alan Carter if I could take the blueprints home with me to investigate the newfound area, but he refused, stating that he couldn't let me leave the building with the original. He did, however, give me a copy. When I returned home that night, I made myself a cup of coffee, grabbed a flashlight, and took a look around my kitchen, around the area where the supposed door was. Mom and Dad had wallpapered the kitchen many years ago, and since it was in such good condition still, I hadn't stripped it during my first decorating session. It was an ugly yellow floral pattern thing, and now that I was up close, running my fingers along it to find any sign of an indentation, I kinda wished I had torn it down before. After a little while of fumbling around with the wallpaper, I did indeed find a small area that seemed uneven. Now relatively excited to find out what was in this new room, I took a kitchen knife off the sink drainer and hacked away at the area of wallpaper. After some tearing and cutting, I eventually tore most of it off. Revealing a door, I tore the rest off. The door was made of a relatively sturdy-looking wood and had no handle. Instead, it had an indent which allowed me to open the door in a sliding motion, similar to how an automatic door opens in supermarkets. The door opened into a cold emptiness. Judging by where this door was, the room was under my first set of stairs. I used the flashlight to look around. There wasn't really anything interesting about this room, or at least there wasn't anything to indicate any reason why it would be wallpapered up. There was a strange smell of dirt and earth, and it was at that point I realized my parents must have known about this place, as they were the ones that had decorated the house before I was born. With the flashlight in one hand and the kitchen knife in the other, I entered the room. Sure enough, there was the set of stairs. It led into what seemed like an endless, deep black abyss. I wondered if I should turn around and go back, but the idea of having this mysterious, strange area open to me while I would be fast asleep just upstairs was kinda creepy, and I just wanted to check it out before I did anything else. I went down the stairs. My footsteps were incredibly loud against the wooden stairs, and as I went further and further into the abyss, the air became more bone-chillingly cold, and the smell of earth became stronger. Eventually, I reached the bottom and discovered that I was now standing not on wood or carpet, or what you'd expect in a basement, but mud. The flashlight revealed that I was now stood in a massively long corridor. Cautiously, I began to walk down it. Eventually, I came across a room to my left, which was separated from the corridor by a thin, decaying curtain. I entered and was horrified by what I saw. Inside the room, I found what appeared to be decaying human corpses. Each was completely torn apart and left in an uneven pile. There had been a relatively mild earth smell up until now, but as I entered the room, the stench of meat had hit me. I immediately felt sick and had to step out of the room for a minute to gather my senses. I panicked. I was about to head back upstairs to call for the police, and curiosity got the better of me. I stepped back into the room and took a better look around with the flashlight while using my shirt to cover my nose from the stench. Inside the room were many strange items I didn't expect to see, given the circumstances. There was a small, broken radio on a shelf, several small teddy bears strewn across the floor, and a rocking horse which had been completely destroyed. Worryingly, I also saw a single bed. Had some kind of sick murderer been living beneath me this whole time? I caught sight of a small worn book which was lying open on the shelf next to the radio, and I grabbed it and got the hell out of there. The police could check where else the corridor led. I wanted to get the fuck out of there before whatever got those people came back. As I came through the sliding door, I tossed the book I found onto the kitchen worktop and closed the door. I was absolutely terrified that whatever had killed all of those people would come back and somehow see that I had been there and come up after me. There was no way for me to block the door, however, and so I decided to grab my cell phone, call the police, and sit across from the door with the kitchen knife. The police told me they would arrive as soon as an officer was free. I sat at my kitchen table opposite the newfound door and tightened my grip on the knife. Eventually, After a couple of minutes, I realized just how filthy my hands and clothes were from being down there, and got up to just quickly rinse my hands under the tap. However, I caught sight of the book I had brought up. I picked it up and took a closer look at it. It was made of worn leather and looked well used. It was also incredibly thick. I opened it, and immediately confusion set in. There were strange childlike pictures drawn of a weird-looking creature and scribbling that I didn't understand. It appeared to be a diary because there were dates on every page, and it seemed to be a diary specifically for 1978. Throughout the diary, the pictures of this strange creature, along with two other scribbles that looked vaguely human, was a recurring theme, and occasionally I saw the word Doug scrolled the pages. I was in the middle of trying to decipher one of these pages when there was a stern knock at my front door. I got up, still clutching the kitchen knife, and answered it. It was the police finally. They searched the house and took me away to the police station. One of my worries was that they would think I had committed some kind of sick series of murders, but the police were actually quite open-minded, and once I showed them the diary, they asked to keep it for investigation. Of course, I let them. I was sent to a police halfway house until my home had been investigated, and when they called me into the police station about 3 days later, they had some news for me. A rather chubby, yet stern-looking cop officer, Reeves, I think, informed me that the corridor beneath my house led to a small electrical shed quite a way away from my house that had been forcefully smashed open from the inside a few years ago and hadn't been repaired. He told me that someone had indeed been living in that room under my house, and after doing some DNA analysis of the hairs they found on the bed in the room, they discovered it to be a very similar match to mine. They also found that whoever had been living under me this whole time had been partially devouring the corpses in the room. He also told me that they had checked the previous medical records of myself, my siblings, and my parents, and had discovered that my mother had in fact given birth to 9 children, the eldest of which was born in 1972, and had been diagnosed with an unknown illness which caused it to have several horrific mutations. I was presented with a birth certificate of the said child also, and when I saw the name on it, it suddenly hit home, and my knees went weak. Born the 29th of May 1972, Douglas Luchini. I am the youngest of 9 children. Story 2. Lifeguard. My name is Lifeguard. There is a lot of thinking that takes place atop the seat overlooking the pool. I spend most of my days there, watching others play, watching them have fun. I see grandparents bringing their toddler grandsons and granddaughters to the pool to splash around. Young parents bring their infants to adapt to the life aquatic. High school sweethearts hang on each other, drowning and whispering the deep secrets of their hearts into the ear of the other. Time on the stand passes slowly. If you're not careful, you can waste a whole day and not have thought about anything. The day can slip away into an ebbing tide of lusts with the barely clad swimmers your age, or you can simply retreat into the room inside your brain where nothing happens. No thoughts are produced, and no ideas are conceived. Lately, I have entertained my attentive brain contriving a man who follows me home after work each day. It's a 24-minute ride to and from work on my bicycle. I think about a man following me home in his turquoise sedan. He rolls down the window, arm hanging limply on the door, and shouts, "Hey, Lifeguard, I know where you sleep. Open your window tonight, and I'll give you a surprise. I think about how fast I'd have to pedal to outrun him every day. Of course, to eradicate all of his knowledge of my residence, I would have had to have done this from the start. I would need to pedal 9% faster and lose him through the path behind Coombe and go for minutes out of the way. These scenes play out behind my eyes as I sit on the edge of the pool. It's not a huge pool. It has a straight slide with a weak drizzle of water peeling down its chute. Rust grows from the base of the object and is progressing upwards. The zero-depth zone is where the babies come and sit, joyfully splashing in the ankle-deep tide because they are unaware of what this place really is. The center was built in the 70s and has not been maintained well. Patrons pay a base price of $2 apiece or $5 for a family and come splash around for a little while. I work with 2 other guards on a double rotation. There's Lindsay, the apathetic snob who clicks her gum loudly while her eyes are magnetized to her phone. Jerry is the other guard who lost his job 3 years ago when the economy tanked. He lost his wife with his work and has been obsessed with conspiracy theories and UFOs ever since. Hey, lifeguard, Jerry says to me one slow day while the pool is empty. You ever see the license plate of that dude you think of following you home? I don't want to think about it, so I keep scrubbing at the scum line and pretend I didn't hear him. Lifeguard, hey, you hear what I said? I looked up and sigh. I haven't noticed it. Why? Jerry shrugged and went back to looking down at his cleaning. The truth was, I can picture it. It's out of state, but I don't know which one. I only know the colors were different. Today is a busy day here at the pool. My eyes have glazed over, and I have lost myself once more in deep contemplation. I picture the man who follows me home as working for a government of a different country. Or maybe I'm just making him up in my daydreams. Possible. It happened before. These hallucinations began with a simple question, such as what if there was an old lady who became a serial killer because she was so afraid of dying she killed everyone who talked to her. Now that's paranoia. Thoughts like these lead to images in my brain that play themselves out. Often they become entire narratives. I have only shared a couple of them with another human, and that human has only been Jerry. He is the only other one who understands the brain-numbing boredom of working at this pool. He reads books on the stand. I can't bring myself to, though, for fear that I'll miss someone drowning. At least if I look like I'm watching, they can't blame me for the oversight. My brain thinks too much. Sometimes it even makes up its own words, like Slender, that is, a being that can pass through walls. It originated one day while I was thinking about the concept of neutrinos, the submicroscopic particles that travel so fast they pass through anything and have only been seen twice, or rather the place where they just were was seen. As my brain wanders, I'm at home and a splinter drifts into my bedroom as the television plays. It cannot speak, but it can point and move metallic objects. It readjusts the antenna on my set and changes the channel to a ballet recital. Piano sounds fill the room and I drift to sleep. The splinter leaves. What a crazy idea, I think as I drift off. Things that can pass through walls. The pool has been busy in waves today, which makes the day crawl by even slower than usual. It fills up, then empties for an hour. The hands on the clock don't even look like they're moving. Maybe they're not. Lindsay is working with me today. I picture an electric can opener It operates by slicing the can in half and pulling the two halves apart and pouring the contents into a bowl. It's all automated, of course. It produces a knocking sound, like a knuckle on a giant, thin tin wall. The knocking continues, and I realize that it's not the imaginary object in my head producing the sound, but someone standing outside the back door of the pool. This door is never used. It was originally installed as a back door for taking trash out to the dumpster. However, the pool doesn't even generate enough trash to warrant a dumpster these days, and garbage is collected out front on Tuesdays. I don't even think I'd ever seen the door open before. Two parents were in the 4-foot section of the pool with their baby, who cried every time they tried to put her head underwater. I figured they wouldn't miss me for a minute. As I went to open the door, the knocking returned once more. It was very gentle still, but more urgent than the first round. I fidgeted with the lock and finally got it open. As I pulled it open, the rusty hinges creaked, and I looked at them. Before I could identify the knocker, my head was slammed with a drained tequila bottle, and I fell unconscious to the ground. I picture no one reacting, and the family of 3 continue cooing at their infant daughter. I tell Jerry about the daydream the next day. He shrugs and tells me he doesn't know what's on the other side of that door either. We worked the whole day, and at closing time, Jerry asks me if I've ever taken narcotics. I haven't. He says maybe I should talk to someone about these daydreams. I tell him I'm not sure if they're all daydreams. I walk out the front door to where my bike is chained up. A turquoise sedan with a blue license plate is parked across the street with the engine quietly humming. I rub my eyes, look up at the sky, and back at the street the car is gone. Figures. I begin pedaling and ride to the edge of the town, on the shortcut path. About halfway to my flat, a splinter suddenly slides out of a tree to my right. It takes control of my bike and swerves the handlebars so violently to the right that I fly off and hit my neck on a baby tree to the left of the path. I lay there for a while until I hear footsteps approaching from the street. I see old cowboy boots walk right up to my face as their owner inspects my busted frame. Net, the man sighs and turns and walks away. I try to reach up and scratch my arm to see if this is a daydream and I'm really back at work seated on the stand. Neither arm stirs. As my vision blurs more and more, and the setting sun fades the objects of the day into ambiguous dark shapes of the night, I hear a car come to a stop on the street, a baseball toss away from where I lie. The car door slams, but the engine stays on. In the dim light, I can tell it's the man who follows me. Thought he'd be here sooner. What took you so long? I gurgle out as my consciousness fades. In place of an answer, he lifts a cigarette to his dry lips and cups his hand to light it. Still not sure if this is real. I mean, I don't feel much pain. I just wish I could move. I wake up in a basement next to a pool table with the green felt torn in several places. I am seated in a metal folding chair. I can move my arms slowly and clumsily, but my neck is frozen in place, tilted severely to the left. I turn my entire torso from side to side and inspect the room I am in. Old Playboy centerfolds pepper the walls, held up by tape over the corners. It smells like stale cigarettes and spilled beer. Empty booze bottles cover every surface. There are literally hundreds of them. The place is spurdant, another word I invented. Even in my helpless state, I still make up words incredible. Most people would be extremely afraid right now. But my name is Lifeguard, and I have to think. Fear would only interfere with that right now. I hear footsteps descending the stairs. Lifeguard. The man shouts when he has neared the bottom. I turn my body to look at the man. His left arm still hangs limply by his side, just as when I see him in his sedan. He stares at me for a second, and my mind races. My training prepared me for this. He didn't bother to check me for weapons. No one ever expects an old lady to be packing heat. I pulled the .50 caliber out of my belt and blew a hole in his stomach, another in his chest. His facial expression changed little, since the porn and drugs had left him looking dead and glazed over already. A pit bull upstairs began barking at the sound of the shots, and as he raced down the stairs, testicles in full swing, I popped a hole in his side as well. I went up the stairs and out into the bright morning sun. I got in the man's sedan, found the keys under the seat, and turned the ignition until it kicked to life. Driving back to my flat proved more difficult than expected, thanks to my now sideways neck. When I got home, I made sure to reload the 3 rounds I had spent. My name is Lifeguard, and I just might be the old lady who is so paranoid she kills everyone else. Story 3. Reflections. A few years ago I lived in a small college town in the mountains. I and a few friends had this nice setup where we all lived in the same house, not like a rental or anything, but a house one of us had in our family. It was a new house built around 2004 or so. But I think I remember hearing that there were some tenants renting out the place before we moved in, a fraternity or something. In random places throughout the house, you could still find their Greek letters drawn into the rafters or in some small obscure place under the sink. In a way, I appreciated that they had left those small letters around, a kind of a way to mark that they had been there, that the house held importance to them as well as it would to us. When we moved in the summer of 2009, it was barren. No furniture to speak of, no food or shampoo bottles, the little things that over time make a house a home. We were able to wrangle together a small couch, beds for each of us, and stocked the place with some summer provisions to hold us over until our financial aid refund dispersed in the fall. As we explored the house, we found that one of the previous tenants had left a light bulb in one of the upstairs bedrooms. We flicked the light switch, and the room was flooded with this red light. My friend, I'll call her Olivia, made a grimace at the light, and I followed in suit. Then we both started to laugh. It was creepy and unsettling, but nothing horrifying. It was kind of funny, actually, that the only thing left there for us was this red light bulb in the bedroom. We joked, and for a few months we called it the murder room. My room was directly next to the murder room. After some time, the other roommates, I'll call them Elena and Louis, came in to help set things up. However, Louis and Olivia both had summer jobs back home, so Elena and I settled in for the next 3 months of relative isolation. She had the room directly down the hall from me, with the bathroom between us in the hall. One weekend, Elena went down to see Louis and left me to the house by myself. If you've ever stayed in a new house or apartment by yourself for a few days, you can understand how creepy it is on your own, but I made it work. I turned on all the lights and watched some Monty Python, Shin Chan, any sort of ridiculous comedy I could think of to lighten the mood. As I sat on the couch downstairs, I figured that I was up for a little scare. I mean, sometimes scaring yourself is a ton of fun, And hey, I didn't need to be up in the morning for anything, so I gathered my courage and popped in a copy of Paranormal Activity. After maybe the second act, I decided that, no, I was in fact not up for a little scare. I switched it off and went back to Monty Python. About halfway through the second episode of the night, a piercing noise began to screech through the empty house. I jumped up from my seat and looked around in a mild panic. For no reason whatsoever, all of the fire alarms in the house started going off at once. They were in perfect sync, alarms in stereo, and I ran into the kitchen to see if I had forgotten some food I had started cooking earlier that night. The stove was bare. I looked around, trying to find the source of the alarm, but there was no smoke anywhere in the house. Then, just as they had started, they stopped, jarred, but with apparently nothing else to investigate. I went back to the living room and resumed watching my shows. About a half hour later, the alarms rounded again, this time not quite as in sync as before. Fueled by paranoia and thoroughly impressed by what I had seen in Paranormal Activity, I ran over and grabbed a pool stick from the corner of the room. To fight demons. Then the alarms stopped again. Deciding that I was done with the nonsense, I switched off the TV and went upstairs to bed. I brought the pool stick with me, To fight demons, I slept with it in my bed that night. The alarms never went off again. When Elena came home, I had told her about what had happened, and she laughed it off. She said that the batteries were probably all dying, and the alarms were going off to alert us to that fact. I smiled and agreed that that was probably what had happened. But it was odd. All of the alarms going off at the same time would mean that the batteries had to have been put into all of the alarms at the exact same time as well. And wouldn't they continue to alarm throughout the night? I don't know. Honestly, I haven't been around smoke detectors so intimately, so I wouldn't know if that was the case. Still, it was creepy. That house had a creepy air in it for a while, until we managed to paint the rooms and make it our own. But we were fools and watched horror movies all night, and so whether through psychology or actuality, the house retained its creepy aura. It didn't help that that was also the summer that I had discovered what a creepypasta was. That was also when the first season of Marble Hornets was in full swing, when it was good. I watched a few episodes and ran down the hall, yelling, "Elena, Slenderman is coming to get you." She would yell back, "Fuck you, I hate you," and it was all good fun. About a month later, maybe around the end of July, I started reading things about mirrors. It was also around this time that I had read The Tulpa, a really good creepypasta. If you haven't read it, I recommend it. Anyway, I decided on a whim to try to scare myself again. I got a full-body mirror, set it up against the wall I shared with the murder room, mind you, and I stared at the reflection. The mirror seemed to be steady enough, so I decided that it was time to experiment. I had read people daring others on X to do this. You set up a mirror, turn off all the lights, and close the door, and just stare at your reflection. Seemed harmless enough. No bogus Bloody Mary chant. No flicking the lights on and off. Just sit and stare. So I did. I turned off the lights, sat down, and stared. It was weird at first, just sitting and looking at yourself. But I sat steadily and stared at my own reflection with a blank face. I moved slightly to one side, and of course my reflection followed me. But then I just sat there, still as a stone, and I stared. I looked directly into my reflection's eyes. The pupils widened as my own did to adjust to the darkness. I mean, everyone had always said I had beautiful eyes, so I wanted to see what all the fuss was about. But I sat there, silently and still. About 15 minutes passed. We were still, and it was then that I thought my mind had started to play tricks on me. My arm would twitch, and I would see the reflection move before I had registered that I had twitched. I knew that I was in control, but it didn't stop my mind from wandering. I was a little uncomfortable the way I was sitting, so I adjusted myself, and the reflection followed my lead. But after I had stopped moving, it was a little like he kept moving his feet, just a little, barely perceivable. I stayed there and stared. A few times I broke eye contact to examine the reflection to see if anything was off, and I could have sworn that it never took its eyes off of me. I couldn't be sure, though, because when I looked back at the face, it was staring at me just as it should have been. My attention shifted to the mouth. I knew I wasn't making an expression, but it almost seemed like the reflection had the slightest frown, the kind of frown you make when you're forced to be around people you don't like. As I watched, the reflection's head tilted just a little, and my eyes darted back to meet its eyes. Nothing. No movement other than my own again. I was growing uncomfortable. Animals will sometimes stare down their foes. Making eye contact is a sort of challenge. They wait for the other to make the first move. I thought about what might happen if I moved. Would the reflection lash out against the glass, ready to strike? I knew it wouldn't, but I still didn't want to move. My mind wandered to the other possibility. What if it moved first? There are some very old superstitions about mirrors. Some say that it is bad luck to catch sight of your reflection while sitting by candlelight. Some traditions hold that any mirrors in a room where someone has recently died must be covered so that their soul would not become trapped behind the glass. One of the most common beliefs, though, is that to see one's reflection, you see your own soul. I couldn't shake the notion that whatever this was I was seeing could not be my soul. It just seemed too foreign, and it seemed to be growing more hostile. Something about it was wrong. I decided that I had had enough of it, and I stood up to turn on the lights and rejoin my friend down the hall. As I stood, I dared not break eye contact. As I got to my feet, I thought, who's really moving, who's reacting? I turned on the light, and I sighed in relief. I slowly turned the mirror around to face the wall, and there it stayed. In the back of my mind, I wondered if the reflection ever came back, looking for me again, only to see the blank wall it was now facing. School came back into session not too long after that. Friends came back and life resumed as normal. A few years later, it came time for me to move out. As I packed up my belongings, I intentionally left the mirror for last. While I was downstairs, Elena called to me from the window and asked if I was going to take it. I came back upstairs to grab the last object, and as I turned it around, I froze. The mirror was cracked. A long, thin crack across the lower half of the mirror, right where I had been sitting those years ago. I smiled and told her she could keep it. Story 4. Monster hunting and other inadvisable behavior. 3:30 p.m. 01 September. One 3-person party entered the Rio Grande National Forest in Hinsdale County. Colorado. They consisted of Trevor Nyson, 37 years old, and Matilda Nyson, 33 years old, a married couple, and Benny Nyson, 8 years old, their only son. 5:31 p.m., 1 September. Trevor and Matilda, highly distraught, encountered a Forest Service ranger to report their son missing. They could offer no details beyond we turned around and he was gone. Matilda experienced a panic attack shortly thereafter and had to be treated on site with 20 milligrams of benzodiazepine. 5:33 p.m. 01 September. U.S. Department of Interior, Bureau of Uncategorized Doabu was contacted. 5:46 p.m. 1 September. A CH-47 Chinook helicopter landed 13 miles SSE of Lake City. CO. Trevor and an impaired Matilda were presented to Doabu agents for interrogation. 5:47 p.m. 1 September. Based on the information presented, Doabu agents confirmed cryptic contact. That's where I come in. Did you know that Hinsdale, Colorado is the most isolated place in the lower 48? There are fewer roads per capita and longer distances between them than any other place. Have you ever wondered how people felt upon discovering that monsters were real? The British Museum assumed in 1799 that the platypus specimen before them was an obvious joke. Nordic seafarers feared the terrible kraken, leaving us to laugh at their primordial beliefs before considering the subsequent modern discovery of the colossal squid. None of this mattered to Trevor, who kept chewing on his hair, or Matilda, who was staring placidly at some nearby leaves. We've established that last contact with Benny was at 37.887 degrees north latitude, 107.21 for degrees west longitude, at 3:33 p.m. What more can you tell me about the departure? I asked crisply. Who are you? Matilda responded in an airy sort of way. That's not important right now, I shot back. I need to know the circumstances surrounding your son's departure. Trevor looked up at me with bloodshot eyes. Departure, you keep saying that word. And how do you know so many specifics? His delayed speech and increased breathing indicated the early warning signs of shock. I regarded him stoically. The sun will set at 7:29 p.m. Tonight, overnight temperatures to drop as low as 59 degrees, which presents a potentially extreme danger to an exposed 8-year-old boy, and the public is unaware of the wildlife that has been documented in Rio Grande National Forest. Each minute spent conversing about mundane nonsense is a minute of daylight wasted. Now tell me, did your son have any food? Trevor stared back in broken defeat, his eyes rimmed with tears. Just gummy bears I grabbed for my radio. Get the Chinook ready to fly now. Matilda spun her head toward me as I prepared to run. Who are you? Call me Lisa, I shot back. Nah, get the fuck out of my way. Asterisk. The chopper landed me as close to the coordinates as was humanly possible. I had to jump the last 6 feet straight onto the ground. The crew flew away immediately afterward. We couldn't afford the risk of scaring it off. Besides, I didn't need them hanging around. All necessary equipment had been packed ahead of time. I found the family's trail almost instantly. There was a path of broken twigs, scattered dirt, and even a discarded trail mix wrapper. I followed their marks cautiously, scanning every inch. It didn't take long for me to find it. An unnatural rise in the grass had snaked its way toward the path that I'd been traversing. No crepuscular animals were stirring. Even the wind was holding itself at bay. I tried to silence my own breathing, but my elevated heart rate prohibited such an endeavor. I looked across the rolling landscape toward the setting sun. It really was beautiful. Root beer floats were inspired by Colorado sunsets. I thought of this fact and worked to calm myself. It had a moderate effect. I reached slowly into my pocket, immensely thankful that I had packed everything I would need. I extracted said equipment, then looked down at my trembling hand. Gummy bears, only red ones, for the love of God, and definitely no greens. I tossed a handful onto the artificial rise in the grass. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the rise coiled around the candy, closing in like a snake, and retracted. I didn't realize how frozen I had become until my head swam from a lack of oxygen. Then I sprang into action, moving my legs to follow the retreating rise in the ground. It disappeared into a copse of trees, then vanished from sight. I stared at the plants before me. No, not plants, at least, not all of them. Broken fir rose in vertical lines along the edges of the trees. The brownish hue blended well with the bark. I wasn't fooled. I stared up at the point where the fir stopped. It towered at least 7 feet above the ground, much higher than my 5 feet 2 inches frame. I listened. It breathed. "Look," I offered shakily, pulling out a fistful of red gummy bears. "There's plenty more." I dropped them from my trembling hands onto the ground at my feet. There was a snort, then a large head emerged from the shadows. It was covered in thick, soft, brown fur. Its 2 eyes, both 5 inches across, were jet black. 2 tiny triangular ears sat atop its skull. There was no visible nose, and its razor-sharp canines would have presented an imposing threat if it weren't for the fact that they were misaligned in a massive, crooked underbite. "FFFFFSSSNUUUUU," it asked. Then it reached out a massive paw, clearly focused on my gummy bears. "Whoa," I shouted, trying to look more intimidating than I felt. I stepped protectively over the candy. He snatched his paw back like I'd burned it. His eyes glistened as his lower lip began to tremble and drool. "No," I yelled, pressing my advantage. "Give me the paw." I stepped forward, causing him to flinch and raise his paws in a protective stance. It was almost funny. This bipedal monster was defending itself from something 1/10 its size, but to him I suppose the term monster would be entirely relative. "Give him to me," I screamed again, and he scurried into the bushes. Cautiously I followed. He hadn't gone far. I could see his brown fur trembling in the dark. I leaned in. Benny Nyson, 8 years old, lay sleeping in the fetal position. A furry arm rested on top of him. I slowly reached for the bag of gummy bears. More slowly still, I raised them up in front of me. I pointed to the boy, and he understood. Benny woke up as the monster handed him to me. He began to panic, I offered as I completed the solemn exchange. I grabbed Benny tight as the giant paws rolled him into my arms. He looked around wildly. I quickly grabbed a bottle of water, opened it, and practically forced it down his throat. After a moment of panic, he began to drink like a baby finding its bottle. A few feet away, I heard the distinct sounds of a monster devouring candy. Benny finished the water, rolled out of my arms, and looked up at me. "Who are you?" he asked incredulously. For the first time, I smiled. "Lisa McMary of Doaboo. You know, you're just like your mother." He looked at me in confusion. "Are you an angel?" "No, not at all," I explained. "I work for the U.S. government." He seemed to understand. "I search for cryptids," I elaborated. "They're what you would call monsters. After spending nearly all of human history hiding in the shadows, they've run out of places to go. Cryptids are terrified of humans, and rightly so. So they've been relegated to the status of legend. Unfortunately, their natural habitat is essentially eradicated. Their only hope of survival is within the government's environmental niche replication program, which is basically a classified government zoo. We're currently maintaining breeding programs for several wild monsters. The one that you found for us," here I pointed to the grunts coming from the bushes, "loves your gummy bears. It's why he took you from your parents." He looked in confusion at the enormous fuzzy brown rear end poking out of the leaves. "Is he dangerous?" For the first time, I laughed. "Oh, no. He's essentially a giant puppy hamster. He's strong enough to rip a truck apart, but doesn't understand how to hurt things. That's why it's so dangerous for him to be around humans who specialize in hurt." The slurping, smacking noise that came from the shadows began to slow its pace. I placed Benny on the ground. He remained in a sitting position, grabbing his head as though in confusion. "So there's a secret government plot to capture monsters." "Cryptids," I corrected. "Yes, the one you just met is eating red gummy bears that have been prepared with a heavy sedative. He should be ready any minute now, right on cue." There was a loud thump. Benny and I both looked up to find that the monster had collapsed just feet in front of us and was now snoring quietly. The overwhelming shock of the situation was keeping Benny subdued. So he continued, Why would you tell me all this?" I smiled sadly at him. "Because the water you just drank was laced as well. You'll be out in less than a minute, and you won't remember a single thing about what we discussed when you're reunited with your parents." I think he was trying to give me an angry look, but it was just impossible with his eyelids fluttering so much. His head lolled once, twice, 3 times, before finally coming to a rest on his shoulder. I gently grabbed him, then helped him to lie on the ground. He pushed me away at first, but eventually settled on sucking his thumb instead. I stood up and looked down at the 2 sleeping creatures. Mission fucking accomplished. I whipped out my radio. "I need an extraction team ASAP. The primary target has been found near the coordinates of deposit. Equip the Chinook to carry 1 small, mid-class cryptid, and alert Cheyenne Mountain Complex that we have a package for delivery. This is important. I'll need 1 large bag of red gummy bears." I looked down at the boy. He had snuggled up to the monster and was now acting as the little spoon, or as the teddy bear, depending on your point of view. I sighed, then spoke into the radio once more. "Tell Cheyenne that we'd better make it 2 large bags of gummy bears." I signed off and stepped out of the shadows. It was 7:29 p.m. The sun was saying good night. It really was beautiful, I decided. Like all the world was a root beer float. Story 5, verse Sylvie. About 5 years ago, I went on a vacation to Wrangell St. Elias National Park in Alaska. The cool, Fresh air, beautiful scenery, and vast expanses of wilderness seemed ideal for my vacation from a tedious desk job back home. I'd saved up for years to finance the trip. I wanted my stay to be perfect. I left in late August to fly from my home in Alabama to Alaska. Everything was going great. My flight was smooth and I set out on my camping trip, alone, into the wilderness on September 1st. I hiked about 13 miles the first day and set up camp among a large area, black spruces. I started a small fire to cook some food around 6 p.m. I still remember how I felt, overjoyed that I was away from my stressful life. I lay back on the ground, looked at the stars through the trees, and listened to the fire crackle. It was a while before I began to notice the quietness of the rest of the forest. No insects, no birds, no anything. All I could hear was my breathing and the fire. Not even a breeze met the branches of the spruces. Later on, I'm not sure what time, I was woken up by a noise off in the distance. I'm not sure what it was. Maybe a falling tree, but it was fairly loud. I didn't hear it again within 5 minutes, so I went back to sleep thinking it had been part of a dream. I woke up early in the morning just as the sun was coming up. I inhaled the fresh Alaskan air and got up to make some breakfast before packing up and continuing on my hike. By the end of the day, I had moved 9 miles from my original camping spot. It was a slower day, but I enjoyed taking my time and soaking in the scenery. I still hadn't seen any signs of wildlife, however. I didn't even see a bird flying above me or insects buzzing around. I didn't dwell on it, though I felt like I was in heaven. At about 4 p.m. I saw the first sign of life in over a day. To hikers, they were coming the opposite direction of me, but they didn't have any gear with them. We were miles from any civilization, so it was weird seeing anyone, let alone anyone with gear. They were moving at a fairly quick pace, and I ended up having to grab one of them as they went past to ask if they were okay, because they didn't even look at me. The guy I grabbed jumped and nearly started crying. Then he looked at me and said, "Turn back. It's still back there." And then he jerked away with me, grabbed his friend who had been staring straight ahead with a glossy look about him, and started walking away, still with a quick pace. I reasoned that the guys had been doing some powerful drug in the woods for fun and had started seeing things. I set up camp and ate dinner pretty much the same way I had the night before, stargazing for a while before falling asleep. I woke up with a start several hours later to what I can only describe as a foghorn. It was low and very loud, and seemed fairly close as well. The noise echoed off of the trees, making it hard to tell where it had come from. I sat up, still sleepy, trying to wake up and figure out what was going on. I looked around, yawned, and was about to go back to sleep when I heard the sound again. This time it seemed much closer, but I still couldn't tell where it was. After a minute or two, I heard trees moving off in the distance. I heard loud snapping noises and branches rubbing against each other and shaking. I couldn't give you an exact distance, but I think it was about a mile away. The first thing to come to my still sleepy mind was bear. I jumped to my feet and looked for anything to use to defend myself from this bear, and ended up picking the hatchet I had brought. This is what the noise sounded like, only deeper and in longer bursts. Favlair SRC equals http://youtube.com. Watch V equals SPWHR-5HPB0, HL equals N_US. I stood around in a defensive stance for a good 10 minutes before I heard the sound again, this time even closer. I heard tree branches, maybe the trees themselves, snapping in the distance. It was within a mile from me now. It then began to dawn on me that what I was dealing with wasn't a bear. My heart was beating furiously, and my mind was racing to figure out what was making the sounds I kept hearing. I couldn't think of anything. The horn-like sound sounded again, this time farther away than before. I stayed up the entire night, listening to it as it got farther and farther away. By sunrise, the noise had stopped. I ate breakfast and packed up fairly quickly. I had decided I'd hike back to the car I had rented and drive off. Maybe stay in a hotel till I could get on the next plane home. It was still early, though, and I thought I'd go towards where I kept hearing the noises in hopes of finding out what they were. I got about 3/4 of a mile from where I had set up camp when I found the first tree. It was completely snapped in half, falling in the direction my campsite was. I continued on, finding more and more snapped trees. They made a trail, almost, that I started to follow, not thinking about the daylight I was wasting moving along the fallen trees. The trail went on for miles, filled with nothing but fallen trees and weird holes, like if a tree had been uprooted all along the trail as well. I figured whatever had been here had started throwing trees as well as knocking them over. By the time I noticed it was getting dark, I had almost reached the end of the trail. I kept walking, exhausted from my sleepless night, not even noticing when the trail stopped, and decided to set up camp for the night next to a large, tall tree. It was much larger than the spruces surrounding it. It looked nothing like any evergreen I had ever seen, and its trunk was blacker than the night sky. I decided the tree had been a victim of a fire. It had plenty of branches, and my idea of setting up camp near it was so I could climb it in case whatever had been knocking over trees decided to come back. At the top of the tree was a hole, similar to one you might find in any tree, and it looked large enough for me to climb into and hide in if I could reach it. I set up my plan, ate a little bit of food, and then passed out, planning on heading back as soon as I woke up. I'm not sure how long I slept. I must have fallen asleep at around 8 p.m., so it must have been about 3 a.m. when I woke up. I was asleep on my back, clutching the hatchet in one hand, when I felt the ground tremble. Whatever it was close. I was pretty disoriented at first from being woken up, but I soon got a hold of my senses. I clutched the hatchet even harder and tried to open the tent I was in when an extremely bright light appeared right above me. It was blinding, partly because it was just a bright light and partly because my eyes were only adjusted to the darkness. I somehow managed to get the tent open with the full intent of running as fast as I could, and as soon as I did I looked up, trying to get a quick look at whatever it was standing over me. A bright yellow light was coming from a large oval hole in what appeared to be the tree I had planned on climbing. Only the tree was, at least it was supposed to be, about 10 feet away from me. The light hovered, I think, about 70 feet above me. I didn't look much longer because I got out and started sprinting through the woods as fast as I could manage. I lost the hatchet at some point, but I don't think it would have done me much good. As I ran, I began to feel the ground quake like it did before, at intervals of about once every 5 seconds. Whatever it was, It was gaining on me. But I didn't have time to think about that because the noise sounded behind me, and it was incredibly loud. I tried to scream, make any noise, really, but nothing came out. Then I ran right into something and fell and tumbled to the ground. I immediately tried to get up and keep running, but soon realized I was tangled up in someone's tent, which had apparently been abandoned. It was then that I realized I was once again bathed in the yellow light. I looked up to the light, shielding my face with my hand, and got a better view of what had been following me. The tree I had camped by was standing in front of me, bent so that the light, from what was apparently the hole I had planned on hiding in, sent a beam down directly on top of me. The trunk of the tree, if you can still call it one, was split to form what could only be described as legs, each making a rather deep imprint in the earth, like what I saw along the trail of broken trees. The tree also seemed to have arms or long, thin branches that hung loosely by its side. The thing stood there, unmoving, and seemed to just stare at me. The light soon became rather pretty and nice to look at, but then the tree made that awful noise again, and I snapped out of my trance. I got up and started running again, maybe even faster than before. I kept running till morning came, and then I kept going till I reached my car. I'm not sure when it stopped following, when it stopped shining its light at me, when it stopped making that horrible noise. But I didn't care. When I made it to my car, I immediately got in and drove off in the direction that I'd come in from. I nearly wrecked several times from exhaustion, but I didn't want to stop and risk meeting that thing again. I eventually made it back to civilization and got the first plane back home. I didn't sleep well for the next few weeks. I live in a fairly wooded area, though I have plenty of neighbors, and had to keep the blinds on the windows closed to keep from seeing the woods outside my house. Fearful that the black tree I saw would be standing among the pines and oaks, I still have nightmares. Story 6, Mountain Magic, coming from the Appalachian foothills of West Virginia, where driving to town was a big to-do. I realized at a young age that people tend to lean toward the supernatural for things that they cannot understand. The women in my family were particularly guilty of this kind of superstition, the kind that only festers among neighbors and families deep in the hollers and bottoms of the mountains. My aunt was a self-proclaimed water witch. She would find a large, forked branch of a specific kind of tree, I can't remember which kind, and walk out into people's fields and wooded properties until the end of the tree branch would suddenly gravitate toward the ground, indicating that there was a natural underground spring below her feet. My mother would claim that there were always more people in the house than she could see, but couldn't explain herself much further, but to say, "I just feel them." My grandmother used to speak of shadows in the corners of her eyes and keys that had been misplaced and replaced to their original spots, piles of small change on windowsills, and the smell of something burning during late summer nights when the stove and heat were off. My great-grandmother used to pour salt just inside the threshold of her front door before going to bed each night. And once, when I watched her performing her bedtime ritual with what I could only assume to be absolute incredulity on my face, her only response was, just in case I became contemptuous of this voodoo-like behavior, and in my mind I dubbed it mountain magic. Swinging wedding rings over pregnant bellies and bodily shivers indicating someone had just walked across my grave somewhere It all seemed so silly to me. I am a very analytical person, and I could make sense of none of these tales, so I dismissed them. And yet, as I reflect on and discuss with loved ones outside of the women in my family the happenings of my life that have come to seem so normal to me, I realize that maybe the things that I have experienced aren't as normal as I once thought. My mother used to call me gifted, but not in the academically accelerated sense of the word. I was not really good at math or a quick reader. She used the term to describe what I've come to know through some quick Googling as a highly sensitive person, or HSP. HSPs, according to my research, are considered to be more prone to experiencing or causing paranormal activity because, through some atypical biological and psychological development, they are more in tune with the paranormal world. I also read that about 15 to 20% of people can be considered highly sensitive, and that it is also hereditary. I can't say that I'm a firm believer yet, but I have experienced some things that I have been unable to explain, and my husband has encouraged me to write them down. So here's the first one I can remember. It's a little unrelated to mountain magic as I have defined it, but it was the first of many more experiences in my life, and I find that the beginning is usually the best place to start. My family lived in New Jersey. My father was in the Army and was stationed at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, which is no longer in existence, I don't think. We lived on Goslin Avenue, a picture of a street, really. Looking back, it reminds me of Make a Man to Kill a Mockingbird. I was very young when we lived there. I attended kindergarten through second grade and extremely extroverted. One afternoon after school, a bunch of us went over to my friend Carrie's house, which was about 3 or 4 houses down from mine. Earlier that day, Carrie had informed us that she had a miniature pool table in her basement, so we all decided that's where we'd be spending that afternoon. I was the first to arrive and had never been inside her house before. Upon entry, I immediately knew why. Carrie lived with her dad who, to me, seemed a million years old. It was dark and cramped in her house and exceptionally warm, with a huge, glowing fish tank in the living room filled with giant tropical fish crammed in, swimming all over each other, and the entire house smelled like that fish tank. As we walked through the living room to the kitchen, her face turned a slight shade of red, embarrassed, and I quickly removed whatever dumbstruck look I had to avoid any awkwardness. After the group all showed up, we made our way down the stairs and into the basement. We saw the pool table in the middle of the floor and quickly took up residence in the patio chairs, boxes, washer and dryer, any place that we could find a seat, and claimed our spots for seat backs. After growing bored of miniature pool and having caught up on all the things that happened at school that day, we eventually ran out of steam and became restless. The only solution at that point, as was logical to us and our childish minds, was to play truth or dare. I remember actively avoiding eye contact and communication with the group at that point because I absolutely loathed that game. Why would I want to subject myself to discomfort just because someone else said I had to? The premise was dumb, and the kids that thrived on it were dumb too, at least in my mind. So after a few rounds of truth or dare and a good 30 minutes of silence on my part, I was unamused and restless, trying to think of an excuse to go home. My mom hadn't called. Dinner wasn't ready. My brother was at his friend's house. I was out of ideas, so I sat there discontent for a few more minutes, and again the conversation died down, and we began to pick at our fingernails. The room went silent. Something caught my eye. My head shot up just in time to see one girl in our group directly across from me, on the other side of the room, and long side of the pool table. Frozen in fear, her eyes wide in disbelief as she stared at what I thought was right at me, I started to say something. I don't know what, probably mocking the look on her face because that was my mo at the time. But my own voice caught in my throat as the atmosphere quickly changed from light-hearted to confused. I glanced around at everyone else to see them all staring at the green felt of the mini pool table. I followed suit, wondering why everyone became so solemn so quickly. A ball on the table had begun to spin in place. I don't know if this has any significance or not, but I can still remember what number it was. 9 with a yellow stripe. We all sat in icy silence, unable to move. I, at least, was unable to breathe. I can still remember the cold aluminum of the lawn chair I was sitting in against my thigh. Slight condensation from my own sweat gathering and becoming slick. After what seemed like only a few seconds, the ball began to roll. It rolled from my side of the table, away from me and towards my friend, slowly at first, almost like it was a struggle, and then it picked up more and more momentum, and as it rolled to the other side of the table, the balls in its path would move themselves out of the way and into the pockets on the sides. When the 9 reached the far side of the table, it stopped abruptly just short of the ledge. By that point, all the other balls had moved into the pockets, and all of our eyes were fixated on the last remaining ball. It paused for a long moment, and I let out a nervous sigh. I hadn't realized I had been holding my breath and immediately felt a little silly, but almost as if someone had flipped an off-on switch. The ball reanimated, only this time it moved straight up. It was almost as if someone had wrapped a piece of fishing line around the ball that I couldn't see and was reeling it up from some secret hole in the upstairs floor. But we had all played at least one round on that table, and a string would have been quickly discovered during gameplay. I watched the ball slowly gain height until it was at eye level with my friend across the room. It then moved directly toward her face, still very slowly with what seemed to be calculated intention. It crossed over the edge of the pool table, traveled another 6 inches or so in the air toward my friend, paused, and then just dropped to the ground with a light crack and rolled away under some shelves by the cellar. The air changed, cool but chokingly humid, and I suddenly had a very metallic taste in my mouth, and without a word I walked as fast as I could to the stairs, through that cramped, fishy living room, and back into outdoors. I didn't stop, but I didn't run. I walked with a purpose straight from that basement through my front door and onto the couch where my mother was sitting watching TV. I didn't say a word. I went over it and over it again in my mind, trying with all my 8-year-old might to make sense of it. I wasn't able to say a word about it for a lot of years because I wasn't quite sure of what I had actually seen. It wasn't until I was 13 and we had moved back to West Virginia to be with family that I told my mom about it. We were sitting around the kitchen table with my aunt and grandma peeling potatoes, and not one of them laughed. She then told me of the history of that street and of the field behind it, Greeley Field, and of her own ghost stories at Fort Monmouth, which I may put on paper at a later date. Each woman took her turn explaining to me the first time they realized they were sensitive, and they congratulated me on inheriting their special gift. My aunt offhandedly suggested that it could have been my disdain for the current game of truth or dare that could have even sparked it, similar to a psychokinetic poltergeist type of event. But even now, at the age of 28, I still dream of that event and often think of my aunt's explanation. The precision of the balls on that table falling straight into the pockets. I can still hear the muted thunks of each one, the slow and deliberate movement of the 9-ball as it moved first laterally and then through the third dimension into midair. But mostly it's the thick air of that basement and the metallic taste in my mouth, the thought that it could have been me all along, that haunts me. Story 7. It comes at night. Maybe you've seen what I've seen. Probably you haven't. But just maybe you have. Either way, I know what I've seen, and that's what matters most, as far as I'm concerned. Believe what you will, I've never cared about that part of things before. I know it's out there, and you should too, in case it decides you're next. I have no recollection of when the first time I saw it was. As far as I can remember, it was always there. I do know that it first started while living with my grandparents, but actually nailing down when its first appearance was a bit difficult. We, my little sister and I, were taken into state custody when I was 4 and were finally returned to our mother a month after my 10th birthday. I can honestly say those years were probably the best of my childhood. But everything has a price, and the price for those years of bliss always came at night. I remember the first time I saw it. I was woken out of a dead sleep one night. I couldn't figure out what woke me, and I sort of laid there in a groggy stupor, trying to gain my bearings. I quickly noticed the urge to pee. So I got up, walked the 5 steps or so it took to go from my bedroom to the bathroom, and did my business. As I returned to my bedroom, I froze in the doorway. I scanned my room, a feeling of dread slowly welling up inside my small child frame. Seeing nothing out of the ordinary, I shrug it off and climb back into bed. See, I've always had the habit of falling asleep to horror movies or scary shows, usually Tales from the Crypt, so I chalked it up to a vividly wild imagination and that damned crypt keeper. As the toilet ceased filling its tank and the hissing of running water died out and eventually went mute, I noticed a distinct tapping noise. It sounded like a dog's nails on hardwood floor, except the dogs were all asleep in the front yard, and our floors were carpeted. I was shaken by the noise for a second, but quickly tried to reason in my young mind that I was hearing things, all fueled by my addiction to scary shit. So I pulled my pillow over my head and tried to go back to sleep. That's when the tapping got louder and its tone changed. It no longer sounded like dog nails on hardwood. It sounded like fingernails tapping on glass. And it sounded like it was coming from above me, coming from my bedroom window. Tentatively, I pulled the pillow from my head and slowly shifted my gaze to the window. What I saw chilled me to the bone. Red eyes glared at me from the other side of the window, malevolence bleeding from them like a stuck pig. Sharp fangs lined a pair of lips that were pulled back like a snarling tiger. Its face was covered with short black fur, and it had a pair of twisted horns sprouting from its forehead. I could make out the shadow of huge, leathery wings coming off its back. When it caught my stare, its snarl quickly shifted to the most evil grin I could possibly fathom. I was paralyzed as soon as I made eye contact, and in my head I could hear a strange, deep, gravelly voice speaking to me, but the language I didn't and still don't know. All I know is it sounded ancient and felt cruel. I don't know how long we stayed that way, but all of a sudden I was able to break my stare and immediately scream like a little girl. "John, John, what's wrong?" my grandmother pleaded with me when she entered my room. I just sat there, blubbering like a baby, pointing at my window, and occasionally letting out an indecipherable squeak as I struggled to regain my composure and remember how to speak. "The devil is on the roof," I was finally able to say. Now, before I continue, I must explain. I have always been agnostic. I absolutely believe there's a higher power, though I refuse to label it him, her, they with any conventional names. A name is simply a way to identify someone, and we should be able to identify the higher power on a spiritual level. Just my belief. I do not believe in the devil, just a scapegoat for the ugly side of humanity. Again, just my belief. The devil is on the roof, I repeated after Grandma gave me a quizzical look. "John, you were dreaming. I keep telling you to stop watching those stories before bed. This is why you just had a very vivid nightmare is all." I wanted so badly to believe Grandma, but I knew what I had seen. Still, I laid back down, and Grandma sat in there with me until I was asleep again. I woke up to a bright morning and no more incidents. The next night I'm lying in bed, watching, you guessed it, Tales from the Crypt. When I hear the tapping again, this time I know it's not a nightmare, as I still haven't fallen asleep yet. I tried to ignore it, but the tapping got increasingly louder the longer I resisted. I was afraid the damn thing was going to break the window, and in my fear, I quickly glanced toward the window. As soon as my eyes landed upon its horrible visage, I was frozen in place again. This time the voice either spoke in English or it gave me some way to understand it, but I clearly heard it say, "Come with me. You have been forsaken. We will never forsake you." "We? Who the heck is we?" I thought to myself. "We are many. We are one. We are here for you, and we aren't leaving without you," it responded, and that's when I realized it could hear my thoughts. We can do more than just hear your thoughts. We can watch your memories. We can taste your fear. And with that, I felt a horrid pain in my head. My vision flared stark white, shifted to bright crimson, and finally faded to black as I lost consciousness. I awoke lying on my floor in the fetal position, although the last I could remember I had been laying on my back in my bed, having a telepathic conversation with what I truly believe to be a demon. I was soaked in sweat and was shivering uncontrollably. I pulled myself off the floor and wobbled to the bathroom. I strip out of my sweat-drenched clothes, climb in a shower, and just let the hot water run over me, warming my still chilled flesh and bones. I didn't feel like me. It's hard to explain, but I was an energetic, happy, exuberant little boy. That morning, however, I felt a dark, brooding energy hanging over me. I didn't want to be around people, and even though it was starting to terrify me at night, I didn't want to leave my bedroom all that day. This continued nightly. Every night I would either be awoken or summoned to look by a persistent tapping on my window, and when I finally would look, I'd get locked into the trance-like state that instigated our mental exchanges, and every day I'd become more and more introverted. One particularly hot summer night, I woke up to an entirely new sound. The tapping had been replaced by a scratching sound. As I slowly opened my eyes, I felt a draft come through my open window. Who opened my window? And then I remembered my grandma coming into my room and saying how hot it was. I remembered begging her not to open the window, and her begrudgingly agreeing to leave it closed. She must have opened it when I fell asleep, and the scratching continued, louder, closer to my head. "Come with me," the gravelly voice, but this time it was audible. I hadn't looked toward my window, using every ounce of willpower I could muster in the hopes of avoiding that trance-like state. But the shock of actually hearing that voice with my own ears was enough to snap my head around out of surprise, my eyes immediately fixating upon this beast that tormented me nightly. It opened its mouth, and a barbed, forked tongue slithered out and flicked the air like a snake. It reached an unproportioned, sinewy arm covered in short, black bristles through my window, and tried to grab at me. In the process, it broke our stare, and I was able to look from the window and move my body again. As I lunged off my bed and toward the door, one of its razor-sharp, who knew, claws sunk deep into the meat of my shoulder. I screamed out in sheer agony as its claw tore through skin and muscle, splashing blood across my bedding and one of the walls. Grandma came running to my room, opened the door, and froze. I don't know if it was the blood, the beast, a combination of the two, or something else entirely, but she to let out a scream. I heard the hard flap of leathery wings and felt a hard breeze push against my back from the window. Grandpa arrived at my bedroom door, glanced around the room, saw the gore on the bed and wall, and immediately had me up in his arms, rushing me to the truck and then rushing to the hospital. The doctor said I must have snagged my shoulder on a nail in my sleep, but couldn't understand how I could get cut so long, deep and with such a clean cut from a nail. 14 stitches in my shoulder, a tetanus shot, and we were sent home with a preventative antibiotic to keep my shoulder from getting infected. That was the last time I ever saw that thing. I know it exists. What it is, I don't know. What it wanted, though, seems clear. It wanted me. Occasionally, I'll still hear it tapping on my window, like fingernails on glass. Despite it being over 20 years since the incident I just wrote about, my skin crawls and my blood runs cold when I hear it. But I keep not only the window closed, but the blinds stay closed at night, too, just to be sure that I'll never get caught by its hypnotic stare again. Never hear that horrible voice playing around inside my brain again. It's out there right now, looking for victims. This much I know for sure, because some nights, after I've fallen asleep, I'll dream things. I'll be gliding over houses and land on the roof of one. I'll lean over the edge of the roof and tap on the window with claws that are clearly not mine, and then I'll hear, clear as day, my voice purring, "Come with me," before my eyes snap open and I wake up.